Nestled beneath Mount Pleasant near the Hocking River, Lancaster, Ohio is rich with history, impressive architecture, and a vibrant art scene. Industrial operations, state-of-the-art medical facilities, a college campus, and unique boutiques are also part of the landscape. But today's bustling city had very humble beginnings. To appreciate present-day Lancaster, one must begin almost 300 years ago.
Funding for Our Town Lancaster is provided by Ohio University Lancaster-Pickerington. Imagine your possibilities at the Lancaster campus and Pickerington Center, transforming lives and transforming communities. Additional funding provided by the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio Reese Peters House in Lancaster. Come let us inspire you. And by the following.
Among the earliest immigrants to Fairfield County, Ohio, were the Wyandot, Native Americans who came to the area around 1730. At the end of the Northwest Indian War, Chief Tarhee agreed to move his people to northern regions, making way for the founding of future Ohio cities and towns. The departure of the Wyandot left the Northwest Territory open for new settlers. But first, they needed a way to reach the wilderness that lay beyond the banks of the Ohio River.
Well, Ebenezer Zane, he approached the Congress of the United States and said, I will build for you a road from Wheeling, Virginia to Limestone, Kentucky, which is Maysville today. And Zane, being the businessman that he was, said, well, pay for my surveying expenses. I'll not take a salary, but give me a square mile of land wherever that trace or trail crosses a river. Zane had already done the exploration. He knew there were three prime places where that trail was going to cross rivers.
One became Zanesville on the Muskingum, the second became Lancaster on the Hocking, and the third became Chillicothe on the Scioto. So he thought that he would be able to make money by selling land in these tracts.
The trace itself was as primitive as you can imagine. He followed, in many cases, animal trails or Indian trails as he went from the east to the west.
After claiming his land as payment, Zane divided the tract at the crossing of the Hocking River into lots, and a frontier town was born.
Emmanuel Carpenter Sr. was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he talked the Zanes into naming the town New Lancaster. And then 5 years later, in 1805, they dropped the new. So the name Lancaster continues. Lancaster, Pennsylvania is named for Lancashire in England. There are essentially three streams of people coming into Lancaster. About half the people in the early 1800s were from the Upper South. And that makes sense because Ohio was settled from the south up. The Ohio River provided a very convenient transportation route, and then they came up the various river valleys like the Hocking Valley from the Ohio River.
This migration of people from the Upper South and then coming in from the Valley of the Shenandoah to meet here. It was a confluence, not only Lancaster being between Zanesville and Chillicothe, but also the different cultures. So this was a very southern town in its makeup because of where the people came from.
In addition to those from the Upper South, many travelers of Zane's trace began their journey from the German communities of Pennsylvania, bringing with them a distinct German culture.
A lot of the early settlers from Pennsylvania were actually Pennsylvania Germans. As late as 1826, there were still signs on shops in Lancaster in both English and German, hence all the tombstones in the local cemetery with German names on them. But growing up, I didn't see them as German names. They just seemed like regular, everyday names.
And there were other Pennsylvania influences in Lancaster. The town itself was laid out very much like the city of Philadelphia.
The squares that William Penn set out for the beginning of Philadelphia is identical to the squares we have in the center of Lancaster, and you'll find that in Lancaster, Pennsylvania as well.
People who went straight across southern Pennsylvania used that model as they went west. In fact, there are some of the same streets in Lancaster, Ohio in the same order as in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia you have Chestnut, Walnut, Locust. You have those same streets in Lancaster in that order.
As more settlers arrived in Lancaster, farmers established small commercial operations to feed the residents of the growing town.
If you trace the census of the county, it was growing, it was exploding, because the word was getting back to Pennsylvania where the Germans were and Virginia where the English were. You've got to come to this place because it's an amazing agricultural opportunity. The farms are lush and prosperous. It's called Fairfield County. The reason being, of course, the fair fields, and it's because we have everybody's topsoil. The glacier stopped right here in Fairfield County. So they left that great load of organic matter, topsoil, in our county as they retreated back into Canada. But once you had this wonderful crop, what do you do with it? A volunteer investigator has determined that there were 13 mills in a 2-mile stretch of Hocking River.
One of the largest and most productive of these early mills was the rock mill, situated on a sandstone cliff high above the gorge cut by the headwaters of the Hocking River.
That wheel is 26 feet in diameter, weighs 20,000 pounds, making it the largest wooden water wheel in the United States. There were only a handful of mills built that size back when Rock Mill was built. All the rest are gone. This is the only survivor.
Although farmers found some of the richest soil in the state and were now even able to process their own grain, agriculture and other commerce continued to suffer from isolation on Ohio's frontier.
They were dead last. In the economies of the United States, they were dead last. The farmers were producing more food, more raw materials for things in other places of the state than they ever had. And outside of state, but they had no way to get it there. Water seemed to be the solution to transportation and doing a lot of it.
When New York's Erie Canal opened in 1817, Ohio's lawmakers fiercely lobbied to secure connecting waterways to their home districts.
The original intent was that the canal would go from approximately where Millersport is now into Lockbourne near Columbus.
And so that was a great tragedy for the city. It was going to be cut off. If the canal doesn't come through your town, then the commerce is going to go to all the other towns.
They raised such a fuss in Fairfield County. What about us? We've got the best agriculture in the state. You have to consider us. And if they weren't going to get any help to do it, they were going to do it on their own. And a fellow by the name of Samuel McCracken formed a canal company to bring the canal to Lancaster and beyond, in fact, all the way to Athens, 56 miles.
It was horrible, back-breaking labor, day after day after day after day, with no mechanized equipment. And a lot of people were injured and killed.
You know, but they're going to keep the canal in a place where it's wet to start with because they need the water. So you're working in water all day. You dug sun up to sundown for 30 cents a day. They fed you and gave you 2 jiggers of rum to try and ward off malaria, but it didn't work.
One of the most difficult sections of the canal was the deep cut, where over 400,000 cubic yards of rock, dirt, and blue clay were removed 1 shovel at a time.
You could dig a trench 1 foot deep, 3 feet wide, all the way to New York City with what they took out of that. Yes, it makes you raise your eyebrows.
When the canals were completed, Lancaster's economy exploded.
Once it was complete, Ohio went from dead last in the economy to first. That's how much of a difference transportation, in this case water, made.
Lancaster was able to have French wine that they would have never had before because it came up from New Orleans. They were able to sell their grain to New York and Philadelphia, which would have never happened before. And it brought commerce, it brought visitors, it brought business. So it was the internet of its day, more or less, economically.
There's an interesting story about one of the canal boats hauling railroad ties. That was prophetic because those railroad ties were dumped off the boat not very far from the canal, and on that were laid the rails and the locomotives and the freight cars, which could haul many, many times, at many times the speed. The speed limit on the canal was 4 miles an hour. Here's a railroad running at 30 miles an hour.
Although the canals were eventually replaced, their economic impact can still be seen today on the streets of Lancaster.
The canal opens up Lancaster to a prosperity that it hadn't known before, and this is why These very attractive houses are built during that era up and down Maine, up and down Wheeling.
There was such an eclectic mix of people from all over the country who had immigrated to this part of Ohio. They knew architectural styles from all over the country, and so they were exposed to things from Virginia, from the East Coast.
You'll see the influence of going way back to the ancient Egyptians. The portico of this building has lotus columns, which were inspired by the temples at Karnak and Luxor in the 14th century BC. And then you will see buildings that have influences from ancient Greece, going on into the Romanesque period, which had rounded arches, and the Gothic period, which had pointed arches. Then into the Tudor style, and then into Victorian, even into Second Empire. Many of these people came from Virginia, and of course they favored brick. The Sherman family came from Connecticut, and the style favored in New England was clapboard or tapered lap wood siding.
Among Lancaster's earliest and most prominent builders was Daniel Sifford.
He did the Georgian, he did St. John's Church, he did the Mumma building over here, he did many of the homes in town.
One of Sifford's most impressive buildings was the home of Samuel McCracken, now referred to as the Georgian, after a tea room that operated there just before World War II.
Well, the house was built in 1832. It was built shortly after Mr. McCracken's retirement. He had spent quite a career in business and was involved in bringing the canal through Lancaster. The house really is an architectural feat for the early 19th century, both federal style of architecture with some really neat neoclassical features, with our curved west wall, with the fluted columns on the west side, other fluted columns surrounding the house. It was known as one of the finest homes in Lancaster at the time. Mr. McCracken himself is referred to in centennial histories as perhaps the richest man in Ohio of his time even.
Each home had to have a leather fire bucket with the name of the owner on a post outside next to the water pump so they could start putting out the fires till the alarm spread and other people would come running with their buckets. And the law also said the bigger the house, the more buckets were required. McCracken had the only 9-bucket house in town. So that was a real status symbol. You can just hear people saying, well, my wife and I have a 6, but our neighbor only has a 4.
As the city grew, the need for qualified professionals, such as teachers, doctors, and lawyers, also increased.
Early Lancaster had a very prominent group of attorneys. Number of reasons for that. The pull of the West, the new frontier, brought the lawyers here just like other folks. They became judges, they became congressmen, senators, and statesmen.
At that time, attorneys traveled a statewide circuit to better serve frontier towns.
When the lawyers came to town, it was like a holiday. People would come in from miles around and to attend court. Many of them, of course, served on the juries, but it was a celebration. From that environment, they were able to get elected to office.
One of the earliest attorneys was Charles Sherman, who moved to Lancaster in 1811 from Connecticut. A graduate of Dartmouth College, Sherman was influential in the law circles of the day and went on to serve as Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court.
That constituted a type of draw. He was a very prominent person, and it took on its own life, so to speak.
Perhaps one of Charles Sherman's biggest contributions to the Lancaster bar was to persuade good friend and future statesman Thomas Ewing to also move to the city and practice law.
Certainly Thomas Ewing was head and shoulders above most statesmen in those days. He served 2 terms in the United States Senate. He served in the Ohio legislature. He was appointed as Secretary-Treasurer
And then he was appointed as the first Secretary of the Interior.
Thomas Ewing invited Henry Stanberry to join his law practice in Lancaster. Stanberry eventually served as Ohio's Attorney General and was U.S. Attorney General by 1865. He also had another claim to fame.
When Johnson was impeached by the Senate, Stanberry resigned as Attorney General and defended President Johnson in his impeachment trial. He was successful in his defense of Johnson by 1 vote. Johnson then nominated him again to be Attorney General, but that time the Senate refused to appoint him, of course, and you can understand why.
Attorney John Sherman, son of Charles Sherman, served as a U.S. Congressman for 3 consecutive terms and in the Senate for 30 years. He was also in 2 presidential cabinets, Secretary of Treasury for President Hayes and Secretary of State for President McKinley. His political career also included multiple bids for the White House.
Probably he's best known for the Sherman Antitrust Act, which of course is, in effect, is still in existence today in one form or the other.
Early Lancaster attorneys provided impressive public service on many levels, serving as Ohio and U.S. lawmakers and attorneys general, in national and foreign appointed posts, in multiple presidential cabinets, and as governor. As the nation teetered on the brink of civil war, like many other border cities in the country, Lancaster was also divided. Nowhere was that division more evident than in the 2 major Lancaster newspapers.
The first newspaper here was the Ohio Adler, Der Ohio Adler. It was a German paper. It was around 1807, 1809. By 1812, maybe even earlier than that, he was publishing 2 papers, one for just the Germans and then one for the English. Same paper, just one in English, one in German. It was always a democratic paper. It always supported the Jeffersonian model of government. Just about every newspaper had to take a political side in a local election, in a political election. It was very important. 1826, Colonel George Sanderson started the Daily Gazette, and that was to be an counter of the Eagle and try to give a voice for the other political views. During the Civil War, the Daily Gazette had gone entirely Republican. It was strictly a Republican paper, 100% behind Abraham Lincoln, 100% behind the Civil War. And the Eagle, however, went with the Copperhead faction and was interested in peace and didn't want to go to war with the southern states. And the 2 papers used to just attack each other on front page editorials, just, calling each other out, saying, they're lying scum. And it was quite fascinating to go back and look at the old newspapers that they were publishing at the time and look at how vitriolic and extremely political those newspapers were. If you picked up the Ohio Eagle, you were a Democrat. If you picked up the Gazette, you were a Republican. You didn't even look at that other rag. We may be reverting more because it's perfectly able now to sit down at your computer and just read whatever your own political view might be. And you never have to go anywhere else. You just reinforce your own beliefs. And I think that was true back in the day.
Though Lancaster was in Ohio, a Union state, there were numerous Southern sympathizers who were loyal readers of the Eagle.
People are shocked to hear that Abraham Lincoln lost the 1860 and 1864 election in Lancaster and Fairfield County. And that's because about half the people who settled in Lancaster were from the Upper South. And they brought their political affiliations with them. One of the ironies is that Lancaster's most famous son is General William Tecumseh Sherman, who is known for his march through Georgia and known for his effectiveness as a Civil War general. And yet, probably the majority of people in Lancaster sympathized with the South to one degree or another.
As the war broke out, Fairfield County sent their fair share of men to serve the Union.
Fairfield County contributed a little over 6,000, not quite 7,000 men during the Civil War. About 60% of all the boys between the age of 15 and 49 in Fairfield County went to the Civil War. Lincoln called for volunteers for 3 months service. The Lancaster Guard marched to the State House in Columbus, and they became the Company A, 1st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. They then were moved from there on down into the northern part of Virginia.
Perhaps Lancaster's most famous contribution to the Union cause was General William Tecumseh Sherman, son of attorney Charles Sherman and brother of attorney and statesman John Sherman. When the young Charles Sherman died while riding the judicial circuit in Lebanon, Ohio in 1829, he left his wife Mary with 11 children to raise.
Little General Sherman, he was only 9 years old at the time. Thomas Ewing came down and said, I really feel I owe a debt to Charles. I would like to take one of your children to raise, Mary, but I would request it's the more intelligent one of your children because I will be sending that kid to college. And General Sherman's older sister, Mary Elizabeth, overheard this, and she went to Mom, pulled on her apron. Mom, you got to send Cump. Cump's short for Tecumseh. You got to send Cump. He's the brightest.
After spending the rest of his childhood with the Ewings, he was sent to West Point. After graduation, he married his foster sister, Ellen Ewing, and climbed the ranks of the Union Army to general. He is most famous for a strategic march through the South, capturing Atlanta in late 1864, before continuing the campaign to Savannah and through the Carolinas.
And as a result of Atlanta falling, President Lincoln is reelected. So Lincoln really owes Sherman now, and he knows he does. So Sherman starts requesting his permission to start this trip from Atlanta to the sea. And he told him, I'm going to cut my supply line, I'm going to live off the land, I'm going to destroy as much as I can. Sherman recognized the fact that the Confederacy had armies in the field. What happens to those armies if they can't get food, ammunition, and medical supplies? They too are going to wither and weaken and die. And that became his purpose the rest of the war, to destroy as much as he could without killing people, to bring a war to the close.
While Sherman's march to the sea was a bold and even controversial strategy, it was a major factor in ending the war. After Lee's surrender and the end of the war, the people of Lancaster were looking forward to returning to their normal lives. But another national tragedy quickly struck.
Again, Lincoln did not carry Lancaster or Fairfield County. That didn't mean that everybody did mourn the death of Lincoln, because it happened after the war was over. So they were looking forward to no war, all the men coming home. So it was a sad time, even though they didn't vote for the man. Everything was draped in black. The church bells rang for 2 solid hours here in Lancaster to mourn that loss. Lincoln was carried down from the presidential box at Ford's Theater. 4 soldiers from the Pennsylvania Light Artillery helped get the body down to the street level. 2 additional men volunteered to help carry the body, and both of those men, one of them was Lieutenant John Sears, one was Captain Busby, were from the Fairfield County area.
And after Mr. Lincoln was assassinated, of course, the conspirators were placed on trial, and Thomas Ewing Jr. Somewhat surprisingly resigned his commission and represented three of the conspirators, Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Edward Spangler. Certainly those three people had no friends in the country at that time. Was successful not in keeping them from prison, being in prison, but none of them were hanged. So he was very successful in doing that, but he didn't make too many friends in Washington as a result of that. It was never known what his father felt about that. It's hard to know how it all came down, but I always felt that it was a very gutsy move on his part to do that.
After the Civil War, Lancaster citizens would soon enjoy better times. In 1887, natural gas was discovered, and as in the canal days, the city was once more a boom town.
There were many wells right here in the city. One of the biggest ones, or the biggest one, was drilled by Theodore Midoff, and I believe it was in 1889 that he drilled it. It was, at the time that it was drilled in, it was the largest producing natural gas well in the world.
Eventually, private gas companies sold out to the city of Lancaster, and the municipal gas works were established, bringing energy to homes, businesses, and factories.
Our forefathers had that vision that, as a utility and an emerging country needed energy. They bought it for $50,000. There was a bond issue. 7 years it was paid off. Started Lancaster Municipal Gas then in 1888, and it still runs today. The residents certainly enjoyed the warmth of that, the convenience of natural gas that it provided, very economical and quality life that was provided, and entertainment as well. In 1889, the fairgrounds was lit by natural gas lamps, and it was actually the first night horse racing event that was lit by natural gas.
There was gas wells dug here on the Fairfield County Fairgrounds that supplied gas to the community. Well, some forward-thinking people thought, well, we'll put these standpipes around our racetrack, our half-mile racetrack, and we'll try to race at night. And that worked. In 1889 and 1890, it's the only fairgrounds in the United States that it was successful at. It was quite a unique thing to run races by the gas lights. I would imagine it would have been a tremendous, tremendous sight. Harness racing was a tremendous deal in anywhere, okay? Because what was the means of transportation back in the 1800s, early 1900s? Was horse. You know, that's how you got from one location to another. And the horse was a very, very valuable animal to the farmer and to anybody. My grandfather told me one time, he said, my team of horses is almost as valuable as your grandma. So that was a very, very important part of their farming.
The Fairfield County Fair began in 1851 and remains a staple of community life today. Held in early October, it is Ohio's last county fair of the year.
It's a great, great time of the year for a fair. We have warm weather, we have cool weather. And, in the mornings there may be frost on the ground, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while people are walking around in their shorts. And the leaves are changing, which we have a tremendous, beautiful background here of what we call Mount Pleasant. The trees are turning color, and it just makes for a beautiful, beautiful scenery for a fair.
Lancaster's abundant natural gas also led to the development of one of the city's most lucrative industries, the manufacturing of glass.
Glass was made here primarily because of the availability of natural gas, and natural gas is what was used to fire the furnaces.
No company had a bigger impact on the glass industry and Lancaster than Hocking Glass Company, later known as Anchor Hocking Glass, after a merger with Anchor Cap Company in 1937.
Hocking Glass started here in 1905, and it was started by a gentleman named I.J. Collins, who was the original investor, and he gathered, I believe, another half dozen people who made the initial investment, and they went over onto Pierce Avenue and bought something called the Black Cat. And that's where they started their glass production, and they continued there until they had a fire in 1924 that basically burnt the facility to the ground. But because of still the need for glass, they were able to rebuild the facility in 1924, and it was one of the first facilities to actually raise the furnace up so that they could drop glass down into forming machines.
As the rest of the country faced the Great Depression in the late 1920s, Lancaster weathered the storm fairly well due to the Hocking Glass Company's production of affordable glassware, now called Depression glass by collectors.
One of their mainstays was tumblers, and basically they were selling a 2-for-a-nickel tumblers. They weren't that fancy. They were basically a plain-sided, smooth glass primarily, and that kept people employed, so the unemployment rate was not really noticed here, and that was primarily because of the glass industry. At the height of their employment, which would have been in the 70s, there were 4,500 people worked for Anchor Hocking in Lancaster, Ohio. Today there's about 1,200 people work at Anchor Hocking, and the largest employer now is the hospital.
Anchor Hocking sponsored company sports teams, a band, a glee club, and employee appreciation events such as large picnics at Miller Park. The park was named after another prominent Lancaster industrialist, William Miller, president of the Godman Shoe Company.
Mr. Miller was responsible for bringing another shoe factory down, and that grew to another and another and another, and pretty soon we had 4 or 5 shoe factories. So Mr. Miller really did a lot to improve jobs and quality of life at that time. He was a very modest man, and many of the donations and things that he did were not made public. After his death, his son, Fred, knew that because he had been so secretive about his generosity, he wanted to honor him somehow. And so he offered City Council to provide Miller Park and a swimming pool for the city to honor his father. And so the city accepted it, of course, good thing, and it was named Miller Park after William Miller.
One of the biggest attractions to the newly constructed Miller Park was a swimming pool.
Interesting fact about Miller Pool is it was built there as a draw and fill pool. A draw and fill pool is one of the pool that you fill up usually once a week, once every couple days, and then you actually drain it instead of filtering it, and then you refill it. And it was originally filled because there was an ice plant across Memorial, so they would fill it with the runoff from the ice plant, and then they would drain it once a week and refill it. So that's why the pool is where it's at, instead of at Rising Park or one of the other parks.
Rising Park, at the base of Mount Pleasant, is named after prominent banker Philip Rising.
What most people think of when they think of Rising Park is Mount Pleasant, and that's obviously the kind of the icon of the park system in the city to a certain extent. And it's a hike up to the top, and you can see most of the city from on top of Mount Pleasant. Something about Rising Park that goes back to the actual deed when it was handed over to the city by Philip Rising. One of the mandates was that there was never any charge for any product or service at Rising Park. So the 2 shelters that we reserve in the city are at Rising Park, and there's no charge.
Like most cities, Lancaster experienced suburban expansion after World War II. While beneficial in many regards, it also led to the neglect of historic downtown areas. In 1962, a small group of determined women, led by Ruth Drinkle, took action to reverse that trend. And so, the Fairfield Heritage Association was founded.
Well, the initial goals were to set out and identify buildings that were unique and very fine, and help preserve them.
With the help of Mayor Edward Rutherford, the women accomplished more than they ever imagined possible.
He went on the radio And he said, if there's anybody out there who's interested in maintaining Lancaster with a reputation for wonderful architecture, if they want to help, they can just come to my office and put whatever they can in a basket. And that'll help go toward the purchase of what ended up being the office. And it's a magnificent building.
The office turned out to be the Samuel McCracken home, or the Georgian, but it looked nothing like it did in the days of its early splendor, having fallen into disrepair and in danger of being sold and demolished.
The Georgian was in very bad condition. I can tell you that when my mother had heard that it was maybe going to be torn down for some other use, she cried. I mean, people were really attached to these lovely old houses. But nobody did what Ruth did, which was get together those people and put them to work.
And when I first went through it, it was really dark in there, not much light. And it was piled high with furniture in every room. And just a little path to get through. And it really looked pretty bad. After I went through it and looked at everything, I told them I thought the building was structurally sound and it could be saved. And so they asked me if I wanted to do the job. Of course, I said yes. We wanted to see it stay just as original as it could, and hopefully look like it did when it was first built. And I think they actually accomplished that too.
Ruth Drinkle asked Fran Utley if she would take the responsibility of putting the house to rights on the interior. And she did, and today's example is perfect.
I know some people are really not too interested in old buildings, but at that time especially there was a lot of interest. There was a lot of that going on, restoration, at that time. And I'm certainly glad they did.
In the early 1980s, corporate downsizing reached Lancaster, and many industries began to lay off employees or shut their doors entirely. The economic effects on Lancaster were sizable, and the morale of the citizens also suffered a serious blow.
We've been asked about the conditions and how things were in Lancaster when this started, and they weren't good, frankly. The economy was in the tank, basically. We had lost a good part of a major industry.
Much like their enterprising ancestors, a new generation of Lancaster citizens rallied in the face of adversity. This time, they took a unique approach to address their problems: the arts.
In 1984, we actually did our first big outdoor concert called Picnic and Pops. And that was so successful that the very next year, we formed the Lancaster Festival, 8 days. So we went from a one-day concert to an 8-day festival.
This festival gave the community a new cultural identity that I think a lot of people were feeling we were losing.
As the Lancaster Festival grew in popularity each year, more ambitious plans were carried out, including the formation of a professional orchestra.
The orchestra is really the cornerstone of the Lancaster Festival. In 1988, we met with Gary Sheldon. He said, you know what? I could audition and create an orchestra that would be our own festival orchestra.
I've had a number of the musicians comment to me, the artists who come in, say, you know, we play everywhere with great orchestras, and this may be the best orchestra we've ever played with in Lancaster, Ohio, and they're always so shocked by that.
And with a professional orchestra, the festival continues to attract big-name musical acts that draw larger crowds every year.
Bernadette Peters, Kathy Mattea, Judy Collins.
Emmylou Harris, and of course, in the recent years, we've had the Beach Boys.
And from that, we go to probably 85 events you could pick from in more than 30 different locations. Almost all of them are free.
We always say it's unusual for a city the size of Lancaster to host something like this, but in reality, it's unusual for a city of any size to host something like the Lancaster Festival.
The founders of the Lancaster Festival tapped into a vibrant arts community that has always existed in Lancaster. One early pioneer of the arts was Richard Outcault, the creator of the modern comic strip.
Maybe if people don't recognize his name, they would recognize Buster Brown or the Yellow Kid or yellow journalism, and all of those items we can credit Outcault for. There were two big newspapers in New York at the time, sort of in competition. In the 1890s, perfected a color press, and so they could do cartoons or comics in color. The title was Hogan's Alley, and the main character was Mickey Dugan, and he was this little street urchin. It was set in the tenements of New York City at the time, and he was bald, he had teeth missing, and he wore a nightshirt. And because of the printing improvements, they made his shirt bright yellow, and so they said it stood out, and everybody came to recognize the Yellow Kid. I believe it's about 1902, believe it or not. He sort of got tired of the Yellow Kid, as I understand it, and he created Buster Brown. Now, maybe you're not younger generation, but at least my generation still remember Buster Brown shoes and clothing and that sort of thing. Some have compared Buster Brown to our Dennis the Menace, the kind of guy always getting in trouble and not quite understanding why. They had been serious or political comics, but now people were wanting to be entertained, and the comics turned more to entertaining them for fun. And pretty soon, these newspaper men realized readers were coming or subscribing to their newspaper for the fun and to read the comics. And pretty soon there was a special Sunday supplement done in color. A few years ago in Lancaster, they were putting up murals downtown, which I think are wonderful. But my suggestion, which was one selected, is done sort of like a comic strip on the side of one of the buildings at the Fairfield County District Library. So I'm really proud of that, because if people didn't before, at least they drive by and say, who in the heck is that guy? And maybe they learn that Lancaster was home to Richard Outcault.
For some reason, Lancaster became a hub of the arts in Ohio, and we've kept that tradition alive. And we're very lucky to have such strong people who support the arts financially, and also the talent does seem to be here.
One group that embodies that talent today is the Lancaster Chorale.
Well, chorale was formed in 1985 as a community chorus. By '89, we were paying all 32 singers, and we were fully professional, and it's gone on like that. We audition annually. We have a stable, if you will, of maybe 40 people or something. We contract to get 32 for each performance. The singers they come from pretty much all facets of the community. They truly do. Some of them are people who have a regular profession or day job or something like that, and then some of them
our career voices who perform in the summers in Italy and Greece and France and things like that. We like to pride ourselves on our versatility, we truly do. We do a wide style of variety of periods and styles of music, and we pride ourselves on authentic, performing it in a style, the way it should be performed. That's about the first comment we usually get from composers. I love the controlled timbre, I love the sound, this would be great for my work, can I write for you? And we work with the outstanding, really the premier contemporary writers all over the world. Eric Sessenvals from Latvia, Paweł Lukaszewski from Poland, James Macmillan from Scotland, and just those guys who, if we're singing choral music a couple hundred years from now, those are going to be the names that we know the way we know the Bach and the Mozart and Handel and those guys now. We have usually 8 to 10 performances a year. We have it's based on a local series we call the Westerman Concert Series. We have those 3 concerts here at St. Mary of the Assumption. It's a wonderful acoustic, it's beautiful aesthetically, and the people are very cooperative. It's fun walking the streets after we have a concert, it really is, because people will speak to a concert, they'll speak to someone having mentioned how great this was or that was, and it's the same way with the festival. There's a buzz in town when something's happening. There's a buzz in town when a show opens. For instance, Decorative Arts Center of Ohio, my wife mentioned to me today. I really want to see that display.
The Decorative Arts Center's mission is to engage people in the arts through decorative arts, through interest in the house and its architecture, through the heritage of this place and its role in historic Lancaster. And it's housed in the 1835 Reese Peters house. The Peters family very generously donated this property to Fairfield County to become a museum. The first floor is the house. It's the teaching about the house and the time period represented by the house, decorative arts of the 19th century. This second floor area where we are now is our changing exhibition space. Decorative arts are objects that have a use in our daily lives that have been designed, artistically enhanced. These are functional pottery pieces, whether they're quilts that are on the wall or that were used for the bed. Furniture, silver, we have glass, things that grow out of a useful tradition. But we like the play against the two eras. Sometimes if we have a contemporary exhibition installed in these historic rooms, there's a tension there, a visual tension that makes you think. All of those pieces came together to make this dynamic, vibrant place where people can experience the arts in a historic setting.
The Ohio Glass Museum also demonstrates how Lancaster's history and the arts can come alive.
Primary purpose was to emphasize the glass in the state of Ohio and in particular in Fairfield County and surrounding areas, because glass has been an important activity in the state of Ohio. We also give a hot glass demonstration to all people that come, so they get to see something actually made. And then for those that want to, we can also do classes, and that's a scheduled item. It can be make an ornament, make a paperweight, make a vase, and you get to do it yourself as much as you can.
The arts have boosted Lancaster's spirit, as well as created sources of revenue for area businesses. And even though industrial downsizing once occurred, new industries were attracted to the city, giving Lancaster a bright economic future.
The industries in Lancaster today are very diverse. Our medical region is just astounding. Right now, the Fairfield Medical Center is undergoing a $35 million expansion for surgical and state-of-the-art care rooms.
When we're done with that project, which is called Project Bright, we're adding 30 new patient rooms. The end result of that will be all patient rooms will be private rooms.
In recent years, Fairfield Medical Center replaced the glass industry as the county's largest employer.
It's never part of the mission or the goals of the organization to be the biggest employer, but that's just the way the economy has changed over the years. And so, we really make sure we're involved in the community and do as much as we can outside of Franklin County, so outside of the Columbus metro area. This hospital is the largest in terms of volume.
This hospital was originally built as a city hospital, and it was run by the city council. It began on this area, this time, amongst some big oak trees, back in 1960. Then eventually, when the new building was built, they changed over into a non-profit hospital association.
Today it is private, so it's a private, not-for-profit hospital. So it's an independent entity, so it has its own board. There's no political influences or anything like that. So it's really here to serve the community.
Higher education has also contributed to the growth of Lancaster. In 1956, Ohio University began offering night classes.
Very first classes that I'm familiar with were held in the high school primarily, because that was the biggest centralized place with pretty good facilities for parking.
In 1968, the first building of the regional campus was ready for students.
You could have somebody that worked for Anchor Hocking in Lancaster. In no way, shape, or form would he be able to go to a campus that's 50 miles away to finish his bachelor's degree. And that was essentially the target market that the regional campuses had. Any number of people that I used to come in contact with felt that they had jobs that they would not have had if they hadn't been able to get that kind of education. Lancaster people want the best for all those people that they have, particularly the young people.
The residents and the taxpayers of Lancaster voted to build 5 new elementary schools. And the average age of those elementaries being replaced was probably about 75 to 80 years old. So we had longevity of those buildings, and they're going to put a nice new modern building, and it will have the great opportunity to educate our children for decades ahead.
Along with improving its schools and other infrastructure, revitalizing Lancaster's downtown has also become a top priority in recent years.
Our downtown has probably gone through the typical phases and changes. Probably in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, everything was downtown. The movie theaters were down there, grocery stores were nearby. And as that developed, things called cars started showing up. And our first mall came in 1960 out on Memorial Drive, the Plaza Shopping Center. And many of the stores and shops that were downtown moved out to that new shopping mall in 1960.
Now that there's a trend away from that and people are really starting to want to see walkable urban environments again, this is the first face they see to Southeast Ohio. Our downtown is the public face of our community. It's the heart of our community. We want to make sure they know we're here and that we've got a lot of good things going on.
Today, the Sherman House Museum is a must-see stop for Lancaster visitors and promotes educational programs as well.
The Fairfield Heritage Association took it over in 1980. They spent about 2 years restoring it and developing it into what you see today. You can see it, you can touch it, you can feel it. That brings it to life.
After years of sitting empty and deteriorating, the mill was gifted to the Fairfield Historical Parks, who began an extensive restoration process to bring it back to life.
Restoration of Rock Mill has been a journey. Indeed, Bob and Rita Steebleton, local residents, gifted that to the historical parks for the people of Fairfield County. So for nearly 100 years, it was going to tumble into the gorge. But it didn't because of the way it's put together. So we looked at the construction, studied it. We looked at the marks on the wood, and they spoke to us. They told us what was there and how it was done and how things were put together. But if you go to the site at Rock Mill, you're going to see what it pretty much looked like in 1824 when they began. In 2 years, we hope to have the mill, and I would say we will have the mill up and running so that you will walk in, you will use all your senses. I rant and rave sometimes about why we tear down such important things to our heritage, things that give us something we can stand on to see the future.
Because if it's lost, you'll never get it back. So it's a way of learning and experiencing how your ancestors or those who lived here before lived, and I find that fascinating as well as educational, so we don't repeat some of those mistakes.
A city without history is a city without a future. If we can't keep our history and reminisce about our history, where is our future going to be?
Fairfield County history is kind of indicative of Ohio history in general. It was such a unique melting pot.
These were rugged people, and I think we have to understand where we've come from, because this was the frontier.
I mean, they didn't think small. They thought big.
Could Lancaster's first inhabitants imagine what Ebenezer Zane's square-mile tract of land would become? The city has seen times of prosperity and hardship. When war divided the nation, it also divided Lancaster. Industrial giants came and left, but new industry took their place. Endangered historical sites continued to be rescued, and the arts also are enthusiastically supported. A college campus and a state-of-the-art hospital serves the region, and downtown is undergoing an amazing revitalization. With such a fascinating past, exciting present, and bright future, it's easy to see why its citizens are very proud to call Lancaster our town.
I guess of all the things that we've talked about, one of the best resources we have is our people.
It is the people. And what grabbed me first when I came here was people named Bope, who live on Bope Road, and named Young, who live on Young Road. 6 and 7 generations of people who have stayed here. So there's a pride and a love for the area.
Some of the people who came were from families of note. Today, you read about them. And some of them were just hard workers. There has been a breath of achievement. I mean, people really wanting to be good at what they're doing. And sometimes it really didn't matter. If you did it, it had to be good. And I think that that is a great thing to have in a community.
Funding for Our Town Lancaster is provided by Ohio University Lancaster-Pickerington. Imagine your possibilities at the Lancaster campus and Pickerington Center, transforming lives and transforming communities. Additional funding provided by the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio Reese Peters House in Lancaster. Come let us inspire you. And by the following: